back, everybody, to another episode of Sunday Reset with Will and Friends. The show where, it's another white boy with a podcast, but we do it live. We say truly, fuck it, we're going live. And so if you're watching this on Instagram right now, fantastic. If you listen to it later, just so you're aware, this show is completely live, and that's what makes it a lot of fun for me. So give me a moment. I'm going to invite my friend to join. And Sir Mike Dog, thank you very much. And hey, Brian, long time no see.
Do we do it?
I think we did it.
Well, holy shit. How about that?
I know. I'm getting better at this. The first couple times, it was always a little weird to try to bring somebody else in because there's not a good way to practice this.
Yeah. So. Well, should we talk to Mark Zuckerberg about that? Or
I don't think he wants to hear from me right now.
Yeah, I don't think he wants to hear from me either, man.
No. But he is allowing us a platform for now, so we'll do our thing. So, how are you, Kevin?
I'm doing well, man. And so I'm in this room that I've never used before, even though I host a podcast. It's a podcast recording studio in the building where I live. So here's this cool ass.
Hold on, real quick, pause.
Yeah. Pausing.
In your apartment complex, you have a podcast studio recording room.
That's right. It goes along with my joke, which I like to say. I'll meet somebody, say at the grocery store, and I'll say, you have a podcast, and he'll be like, no, I don't. I'll be like, yeah, you do. Everybody's got a fucking podcast. But yeah, there's a recording studio in here.
That's awesome. Wait, so what does the sign say?
It says the spoken word.
The spoken word.
Nice neon sign. Isn't that cool?
That is the most 2025 thing I've ever heard. I live in an apartment complex that has a studio for recording podcasts.
You're right. That is very, very 2025 for sure.
Could you imagine saying that to somebody, even 10 years ago? Like, hey, this is going to be a common amenity. A lot of apartments have a pool or a gym, maybe on-site laundry if it's not included in the building. Can you imagine being like, hey, there's going to be a studio in here? It's going to be
for a
studio for a podcast.
Yes. So that you can, let out your thoughts on, I don't know, the events of the day.
Well, when you really think about it, podcasts are basically just talk radio on demand.
Absolutely.
So, the format always made sense to me. I just think it is funny, though, because, that was my whole thing in starting this. Was I even joked about it before you joined. I said, I'm another white boy with a podcast. I understand. I know this is silly. So when I went in, I was very hesitant and very apprehensive. My wife knows this. I was like, I get it. I get why it's a value add for me. But, if I'm going to do it, I want to do it differently. I want to find a way to, bring something else to the table. And so to me, the best thing I could do was fuck it, let's go live. Let's do it. Let's do it live. There are no edits. Half because I like it that it's just raw, authentic, right off the top of the head. The other part is I'm lazy and I don't want to edit it. So it serves both purposes.
I luckily have a good friend who hosts a great podcast called Hysteria 51. His name's Brent Hand. Brent edits the minimal editing we do on Behind Beautiful Things. There's not much, right? As you were on it, and most of the editing is taking out my at the beginning where I just say a lot. Because I want it to be kind of what you're saying, like a genuine conversation, a back and forth, etc. Now, of course, if a guest comes on and says, oh, can we cut that out? We, of course, cut that out, right? But in general, we try, it's a pretty free-flowing thing.
Yeah, and on that topic, I guess we should take a moment to introduce you. It's this thing. I'm still so new at this. I don't even have true format.
Oh, you're doing great.
So, yeah, why don't you take a moment to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name's Kevin Crispin. I host a podcast called Behind Beautiful Things. It used to be called Sad Times, and let me tell you why I changed the name.
I would love to know, because I don't even know the answer to this.
Yeah, the reason I changed is it wasn't representing the show very well anymore. Now, each week we have a guest, of which you have been one, who come on to tell a story from their life. Often they are difficult stories, and the whole goal here is to allow these difficult stories to be told, not to judge them, not to solve them, not to try to diagnose what might be going wrong, because all of us, when we deal with mental health issues, we feel isolated, we feel alone. And the whole goal is for somebody to tune into our podcast, Behind Beautiful Things, hear a story and say, oh, I thought I was the only one who felt that way. But on the show, even though they are difficult stories, it's often not a sad discussion. It might be people relaying some very sad information, but we try to bring levity to when appropriate, and there's a lot of hope in the show. It's a lot of people who have gone through some very, very difficult times, and they're doing something that I find extremely commendable. You do this as well, which is you've taken a hard time in your life or a hard section or piece of your life and turned it around to help others who might be going through the same thing, right? And so that's what Behind Beautiful Things is. We come out every Tuesday. You can get us wherever podcasts magically appear on your devices. I'm somehow on my Instagram, Behind Beautiful Things, and now I'm on here with you, and I mean, I don't know who the hell knew this would happen.
And thank you for clarifying it. Yeah, because so when I was on his show, I was on Kevin's show, it was still called Sad Times. And so even I didn't know the answer of like where that came from. But it makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
What you're describing. So I'm cool. I'm glad to see that you're doing that. And now you keep saying we. So who all's involved?
Brent, who's my producer. It's mainly Brent and I now. And of course, each week the star of the show each week is the guest telling the story. So I'll kind of give you a little bit. You know how this works, but for anybody who's watching and is interested in being on it, I had one about an hour ago. I have what are called prep calls. And the reason I do this is people come on this show and sometimes talk about extremely, extremely difficult things. And I want to make sure that those people know exactly what we're going to talk about when we record. And so I have them tell me their story, and then I do I build an outline and I send it to them. It's not a script or anything like that. It's for them to say, oh, yes, I'm good with saying all that. Maybe not this line, cut that out, and maybe we don't talk about this, but oh, I forgot to mention, this time when I was on vacation or whatever. Add that in. And then when the guest says, okay, that looks good, then I lock the outline into place so that they know I'm not going to ask them some sort of weird out of left field question that they're not prepared for. Because again, people are coming on the show to be very vulnerable and share amazing stories from their lives, and I want to make sure they feel as comfortable and safe as possible. So when I say we, it's really Brent and I, and then that one part of me that I wish I had, which was self-promotion, but
I know it's such an uncomfortable thing for even like when I do this, like I didn't today actually, funny enough, but most of the time I send out like a text to everybody that I know, like, hey, just so you know, I'm doing this.
Yeah.
And the live part is fun because I've been as high as like 30 people watching, and then I've been as low as right now, which is like 3 to 4. It flops on around. One will always be my wife. She always watches it live, but in another room.
Nice.
And what's funny, because I actually commandeer her office.
I was going to ask about the shelves behind you, the books. Yeah.
Yeah, they're all hers. I don't read. I write a book. I don't read them.
That's probably.
I'm kidding. I do read, just not. It's weird. I go through these phases where I'm writing a lot, and then I just it's like I can't have too many things going on in my brain at once.
Yeah.
So I end up not. But no, she is a voracious reader. Every year she's trying to level up to say like, hey, okay, I read 35 books this year. I'm going to read 50 the next year, and stuff like that. She's a force within. She goes through waves, and now she's like doing multiple different mediums. So she'll be like, okay, I'm listening to this audiobook, but then I'm reading this one, but then I've got this one going on my Kindle, and I'm like,
right.
I don't.
And then my Kindle's over there, and it's also now on my phone.
Right.
I can read it here because I can't reach my Kindle.
Oh,
let me.
She's got. By the way, she's got like she's got the thing now where it's you can put your Kindle right there and it holds it for you, and she's got the little automatic clicker, so she can be all bundled up under a blanket. Clicking
serious?
Oh yeah,
I didn't know those existed.
Oh, it's the coolest. I respect the hell out of it. So she's just laying down there and just clicking away. It's great.
I tell you what, I have a Kindle, but my eyesight is continue to get worse. I now have progressives on, right? Which, by the way, if you've ever had progressives where it's like bifocals but without the line,
Ah,
so you feel like you're going to throw up for about the first week because your brain's not
doing this.
used to that. But now I could do that, but I would be clicking that button because the print would be so big. It would be like, call me, click, Ishmael, okay?
Got
Click,
it.
right? But I think that's amazing. And I don't know. I know you read. Are you more of a Kindle or a book guy? What's your feeling on that?
It's changed over the years. I have a Kindle. I don't know that I've ever actually used it.
Uh-huh.
I would probably be more on the physical copy side of my thing. And lately, I just recently got into audiobooks. Has been a popular one for me, just because like I find that the time that I have the most downtime is when I'm driving,
Right.
and so that's like the great. Like I just this week I had for my day job, I had to drive about 4.5 hours each way, and it was great just to like turn on not a podcast. All right, sometimes I listen to podcasts, but sometimes it's nice just to have someone like tell me the story and I can get follow along with it. So it was really great.
Yeah. Uh, did your mind wander with audiobooks? That's part of my problem with audiobooks. That's not the medium's fault. That's I'm blaming myself.
So I think that's true. The answer is sometimes. So I find that to be true if I'm laying in bed and I know I have a lot going on. Then I
Mhm.
find that I wander. But what was nice about driving is I really had to focus on one main thing. So I kind of blocked out because that's my problem with I don't understand people who can listen to podcasts or anything with dialogue while doing other tasks. I am baffled by that all the time because
Really?
I just don't. I can't do it. My brain. I'm focusing so much on the dialogue. Like people always like, oh, it's a good background TV show to have. It's a good
Right.
background TV show to have while you're like cleaning around the house. I'm like, in what world are you watching a show while you're cleaning? I'm like, I can't do both.
Yeah, I don't know if I watch a show while I clean, but will listen to podcasts. Like, so if I'm doing the dishes or folding laundry or whatever it is, the boring ass shit that we have to do every day, I do love having a podcast on and listening to that. Now, I'm sure that I, of course, miss some of it, but I can't, and maybe this is different for you and your wife. I don't listen to fiction audiobooks. Now, I read fiction books always. I read fiction and nonfiction, but when it comes to audiobooks, I only listen to nonfiction for whatever reason.
So I just started a nonfiction, or sorry, I just started a fiction book in
Okay?
audiobook. It's so the Alex Cross series just got a new
Yep.
TV show with Prime, and it made me realize I haven't read those books in forever, and I realized that they're on Spotify Premium, and I was like, oh, cool. So I started right at the beginning. I think it's Along Came a Spider. It's the first one, or something.
Kiss the Girls, Along Came a Spider
Yeah,
are like the early ones. I don't know
yeah,
which came first.
yeah. And so I started with the spider one. It actually Tay Diggs is the narrator.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, so that was fun. So it was a very smooth sounding voice. I think it does. To be fair, I would be curious to know if there's what happens if it's a book that I've never read or been or had any involvement with, or I don't have any pictures to go with it. Because I can tell you right now, like when I was a little kid, I hated reading. I hated reading, and then and I'm talking like really low, like early reading age. And then around the time the Harry Potter books became popular was around, when the first movie was coming out too.
Uh-huh.
And I think seeing Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone and then being able to read it later and like get all the extra details and stuff, I think it really like sparked something in my brain to be able to like imagine this world. And then I just read way past where the movies were because but it was the first time I was like able to connect the dots of like, oh, you visualize it in your mind.
Right.
Or at least
It's
that's
it
how I
was
do it.
this kind of gave you a stepping stone to get to not a philosopher's stone or a sorcerer's stone, but a stepping stone to get to what the world looks like, right? But
Yeah,
then that's one of the best things about reading, of course, is that, oh my God, what's going on in here? You're reading. I always say reading is a form of listening.
yeah,
Um,
that's a good way to look at it.
and I don't know, it's my favorite thing to do. And I know this has nothing to do with my podcast, but I'd rather read than do almost anything in the world.
So what's like, you mentioned fiction. What's like the go-to subgenre of fiction that you like really dive into?
You know what, man? I love a good thriller. I love a good cop procedural, and I love horror. I've read over 40 Stephen King books. I like literary fiction, and I have read the classics. Not all, certainly not all of them by any means, but
You quoted Moby Dick just like two
well,
minutes ago.
I mean, everybody knows that. I mean, everybody knows that first line.
Do
I've
they?
not read that
Do
book, to be
they?
clear. Call me Ishmael?
I think in 2025, that's a little harder to come by.
Okay.
I think if you polled everyday citizens, I'm gonna guess 2 out of 10. If you say "Call me Ishmael," can associate that with Moby Dick.
Okay. Well, maybe some of those people have seen Major League, because in Major League he's reading the comic book version of Moby Dick to impress his female interest.
Okay, I haven't seen Major League in a very
Oh
long time. I'll have to
God, I
that.
watch it like once a year. It's so good. So
Are
fucking good.
are there any other movies that you watch that are like every year or every so often, like on like a regular cadence?
Die Hard.
All of them are just the original.
Oh, just the
Okay.
original. Now I've of course seen all of them, and three of them are the first one, the third one, and the fourth one are well, the first one is classic. The third one is very, very good. The fourth one is fun. The fifth one is heinous, and the second one is not that great. But I've watched all of them many times. But Die Hard, the original, is probably the movie I've watched more than any other movie that I can think of. What else do I watch a lot? Airplane, that's my favorite movie. Um, hmm. I do love a good action movie, man. You know, those
Yeah.
are very rewatch. What about you?
You know, I think my favorite genre is the thriller, like the one that's really got you thinking or something along those lines. But I think ones that I fall back to a lot are action movies, just because sometimes I just want to watch shit blow up in cheesy lines,
That's
and
right.
that's okay.
Yeah.
Like, and I like not ashamed, like no shame in my game at all. Like I love like Fast Five. It's like a
Okay.
go-to one for me. I
Yeah.
don't know why.
The,
Uh,
Specifically the fifth one?
Specifically the fifth one.
Okay.
Yeah, like it's kind of like how you feel about Die Hard. Like I can give or take most of them, but
Yeah.
the first one is the original, which is basically Point Break but with cars. If you think about it, and then for whatever reason, the fifth one was like right at the line where they were like, okay, we're not taking ourselves too seriously. These guys are basically superheroes now, but it's still not like they're not going to space just yet either.
Wait a
You
minute.
know?
They go to space?
Oh yeah, oh yeah. That's actually what's made that. Once they started like being in on the joke, then I thought it got better.
Yeah, oh,
Frankly,
sure.
with him. Like so they like they had a whole bit in like one of the more recent ones where they were like, "Do you realize every time we're in a gunfight, none of us ever get shot?" You know?
Did they say that?
Oh yeah, he like calls it. They call it out like straight up. And it's like, yeah, I think you have to be in on the joke, and that's what makes those entertaining and stuff. But when you're taking yourself too seriously, that's when I think it kind of falls apart.
Yeah.
So you know what? One more recent movie though that I keep going back to probably every 6 months, The Gentleman, the Guy Ritchie movie.
Dude, so my dad tells me I've not watched that movie and I need to watch it.
Really?
And there's a
Okay.
show, right? Isn't there a television show based on it or something?
So there's okay. I can tell you one piece of it without really spoiling anything, which is that like the show centers around the fact that like old aristocracy in the UK and parts of Europe, a lot of these families are old money and cash poor
Uh-huh.
in the current time. And so there's this whole criminal underworld that exists to like, hey, we're going to run our enterprises under your house and, give you a cut because the cops aren't coming to your house. You're an aristocrat. You're of nobility. They're going to stay away from you. And in return, I get to have a safe place to like grow a bunch of weed or something along those lines. And so in that sense, that's where the shows intertwine, where they both exist in that dynamic.
Gotcha.
But none of the characters are a crossover, as far as I'm
I
aware.
see. Now, how many Gentleman movies are there?
There's just one.
There's just the
There's
one.
just
Okay.
the one. There's just the one. It stars Matthew McConaughey, Charlie Hunnam, Hugh Grant. Trying to think who else is in there.
You love
Henry,
Matthew McConaughey.
Henry Golding.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's about it that I can. Oh, Colin Farrell's in it.
Did Guy Ritchie
It's
make that?
Yes, Guy Ritchie made it, and then I don't think he directs the show. I think he produces the show.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, and the show is entertaining too. If you're a Theo James fan, yes, my wife Henry Golding.
Is that
if
her?
you ever find this?
Is that her making that heart thing?
Yes. Oh, Henry Golding is on her hall pass list for sure. Yeah.
Oh, I think that's fair. That's fair.
Yeah, he's a good-looking dude. I don't blame her at all.
Yeah.
It'd be one of those things you know what? I respect that. That's fair.
Yeah.
See, this is what I love about this whole live format is I had no idea we were going to end up where we are right now.
Oh, I know.
And it makes it fun for me. But I want to actually bring it back around though, because I also love how seriously you take your show, because you can tell that you put a lot of thought and intentionality into the questions you ask. I'm not even making this up. You are to date, and she's going to watch this later, the favorite podcast appearance that I've ever made on somebody else's. My mom loves our episode on your show more than any other podcast I've ever been on.
Oh, that makes me so happy.
Yeah, I distinctly remember her calling me and talking to me about it, and so I have to credit. I think a little bit, for me is I by the time I did yours, I had done a handful of other shows, so I got a little more comfortable with it. But the big thing is you come so well prepared and so intentional with your thoughts and ideas and how you want to approach the show and what questions you want to ask, and you can tell. So, if you don't mind me asking, what made you get started? What made you decide to put this much thought and intentionality into it? Where does it all come from?
Well, my brain doesn't work real well. It gets me into some trouble. I've dealt with anxiety, major anxiety, minor depression my whole life. I have obsessive compulsive disorder, and when I was a kid, I would have these racing thoughts and just worrying about one weird one. So weird. I was worried I was going to stick my head in a tornado siren and lose my hearing. Now, when you're 5, how do you go and tell somebody that? Because they're going to be like, hey, don't stick your head in the siren. I go, you're missing the point. I'm worried it's going to happen, right? So I thought for a long time that I was the only one who felt these things, who had these racing thoughts, and I couldn't articulate it. I couldn't talk to anybody about it. And then at some point, when I was a kid, I found out, no, this is unfortunately something that a lot of people suffer with. And it was a seminal day in my life because I felt less alone. I did not feel isolated. I did not feel alone. And I know that you know this very well, Will. Mental health can isolate us. And so fast forward a number of years, I did a one-man show just about my journey with anxiety and how it's affected both my childhood and my adulthood. And, I had a rule for that show. I talked about my family. I talked about friends. I talked about other mentors in my life. The only person in that show who was allowed to look like an idiot was me, because these are people who surrounded me, showed me love the best way they knew how, and I was still struggling. And then a couple years later, a friend of mine actually was going to start a Twitch channel. And very similar to this, he said, I'd like you to do your one-man show on there. And I said, well, I've already done that. And then I got the idea for what has become Behind Beautiful Things, which is I want to have people come on and tell a story from their life and not solve, fix, judge, none of it. Just allow the story to be told so that someone somewhere can feel less alone. And I have met so many amazing people doing this, obviously yourself included, that I feel like very very lucky every time that I record. Like I recorded 12 episodes last week, and the stories that you hear, Will, and the people that you talk to, and the resilience of human beings, and I try to put in humor when appropriate. Obviously, there are times when it's like, well, maybe not, maybe let's not. I like to say that kindness is the only thing that makes sense to me 100% of the time, but humor is right behind it. It's like 98, 99%. And so that's how I got to the show. And then with my friend helped me start it. Then he handed it over to Brent, who I've mentioned a number of times. Brent, who hosts Hysteria 51, which is a great podcast. And Brent's like, you should bring it back. It was after COVID and all this stuff. So I did. And I just continued to meet amazing people. And it's all about helping people feel a little less alone. Something I say on the show is sometimes is stories are the great healing power of humankind. The more we hear, the more we heal. Um, and the other thing I say is difficult stories are universal, but they're not universally told. And to be clear, anybody who comes on chooses what we talk about. It's not prescriptive. Nobody's forced to say anything. These are brave people who come on and tell their stories and what they've gone through so that somebody somewhere, can feel less alone. Did I answer the question?
You
Oh,
did.
good,
No,
good.
and you had a couple of great quotes in there.
Oh, thank you.
That I
Was it Call Me Ishmael? I didn't do that one.
Yeah. Unfortunately, no. That would
No,
be a
Herman
much
Melville.
yeah, just some guy named Herman, some
Herman.
Herm. He might
Herman.
have wrote
Hey,
something
Herman.
he might have wrote something you might have heard of at one point
One
in
time.
time. I don't know. Something about a fish.
Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Sounds pretty boring to me, but
Yeah,
it is
whatever.
what it is.
Whatever.
So, but like that, and again, I think that's what I keep finding over and over again is when I speak to other creators in this space, whether it's you have a podcast or you're on social media or whatever the case may be, where you're creating content on this. That is one central theme that I keep finding with people is all of us feel on some level this, I don't want to say obligation, that's the wrong word, but a sense of pride, really more than anything, to share these stories. Because the same thing, because again, we all relate to this one thing, which is when we were in these worst parts of our life, we felt entirely alone, and that's the worst place you can be. And so, how do you counterbalance that? How do you seek to solve that to prevent somebody else from going through that, or at
Yes.
least because we can't prevent the act, we can't prevent the things that happened in their life that got them to that point. But what we can hopefully do is make that feeling feel less, make you feel like you're not alone in that endeavor, right?
Right.
Because when you're alone, everything gets 10 times worse, whether it's depression, anxiety, your compulsions. When you feel like not only is this thing that I don't understand, but it's something that nobody else can possibly relate to, it gets really, really, really hard to navigate life. You mentioned your obsessive compulsive disorder. I mean, I have to imagine until you learned that somebody else felt that way, that had to be isolating.
Oh, very, very much so.
Yeah.
And I wrote a long essay about this, but there's actual OCD and then what I call pop culture OCD. Okay. So pop culture OCD would be like, let's say you and I worked in a office together, and you came over to my desk and you started messing with my folders, and I went, I'm real OCD about folders, right? My re my rejoinder to that is I'm not OCD about folders, I'm OCD about life. Because what people I think may not understand about OCD is it's the quote sexy part, the compulsions. That's the least of the problem. It's what goes on up here and the racing thoughts and the ruminating and all of those things. And then you do the compulsions in order to help make yourself calm down or feel safer. But you got to hide the compulsion sometimes. How do you talk to somebody about it, especially, 20, 30 years ago? I mean, I saw As Good as It Gets in the movie theater. You ever seen that movie?
Oh yeah.
One of my all-time favorite movies. And my OCD does not manifest the way that his does, but I cried. I was 15. I cried because I was like, that's it. That's it. you know, and just seeing representation, right?
Right.
So yeah, because everybody's like, well, what's wrong with you? What's wrong with you? Well, I've been on medication longer in my life than I when I wasn't on medication. I've been on medication for almost 25 years, and I need it. I've tried to go off it, doesn't work. But that's just my journey. But when I first started, it wasn't really anything people talked about,
Right.
even in the past 25 years, and now we do. And I think it's also about the stigma, taking away the stigma of people who have challenges and are trying to do better.
So you mentioned the pop culture aspect of things, though, because like, but there's also something to be said for that too, in terms of like I wouldn't say misinformation, but I think sometimes in popular media, certain conditions and disorders are illustrated in such a way that like leans itself to the drama of a show or something along those lines. And that's not, to your point, that's not necessarily everyone's situation. But if that's someone's very limited view of what this is, perfect example, autism spectrum disorder.
Uh-huh.
We see basically in television, movies, books, we see two versions of it, which is the person that can't articulate at all and is, it's just a very specific look and feel, or it's like, oh, they're the savant genius. And there's nothing in between. Because again, those two things help carry forward the story in a certain way. If they're the savant genius, then it's like they're misunderstood and they're just kind of a jackass in certain ways. But like, and again, are all of them? But like people, that's how they view it. They see someone like a Dr. House, and they're like, oh, well, that's just how everyone on that version of the spectrum is. But not
Right.
everyone is that way.
Right.
And so so while it is great to have that representation, it does also have a double-edged sword to it, right? Because then it's
I
like
agree.
that's the only way people can associate to it. Do
Yeah.
you find that happening with obsessive compulsive
Um.
disorder?
Yeah. I think in a way, I've watched a little bit, not a ton of it, but like my sister really likes the show
Okay,
Monk. Do you know Monk?
yeah,
Tony
I've
Shalhoub,
never
and
watched it, but I know it.
yeah, it's a procedural, but he has obsessive compulsive disorder, right? And they don't over glorify it, at least in what I've seen. Um, I think it's just there's a lot of what's called magical thinking in OCD, where if I think a thought or if I touch something the wrong way, someone might be hurt. I know a lot of people who struggle with this is not something that I've struggled with, but I know a lot of people who do struggle with OCD who, when they were kids, they would stay up all night worrying that something was going to happen to their family. And they were trying to use their brain to stop it, not because they thought they had control over the world, but because they're ruminating. And when you ruminate, you get really stuck in it. An old a psychologist friend of mine says he'll every once in a while he'll see me. He's like, I see you're swimming, Kevin. You're swimming in it, right? It looks like you're just down in it, and that does happen. And people are scared of very real outcomes that uh, there's a fucked up form of logic around all of it, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So if you were going to try to paint a picture to somebody that doesn't know you at all, but they learn, hey, this is Kevin and he has OCD, how would you try to illustrate what goes on in your mind?
um, let's take an actual example that happened to me when I was a kid.
Perfect.
This is another weird fucking thing I was afraid of. Okay, when I was about 11, I was watching a TV movie with my mom. I don't remember the movie, but I remember somebody died in the electric chair. That planted a seed in my head that that's a way I could die. And then I became more, and then I couldn't stop thinking about it. That's the other thing, rumination. You can't get out of the thought patterns. And so that's why you do, like, I have to touch things certain ways. I have a number, it's 16. I count my steps. Um, and I was just more and more would just think to myself, I'm going to die in the electric chair. Now I'm in sixth grade. So I can't turn to my friend and be like, hey, you ever worry about dying in the electric chair? Because they're going to be like, what the hell's wrong with you? But it came to a head when I was on vacation with my dad and stepmom and my aunt and uncle, and I had a full on breakdown on the streets of Chicago because I could not stop thinking about it. And I was just so afraid. And what happens with anxiety and with OCD is it's certainty. When you feel that emotion, or that fear, you're certain it's going to happen. Now, people could come and say, do you have a criminal record, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Not going to work. The logic isn't going to work. It's the emotional certainty. So my dad didn't know what to do, and so he took me back to the hotel. He did his best, and he said, what's wrong? What's wrong with you, Kevin? And I'm thinking to myself, well, I guess I should tell him the truth. So I said, I'm afraid I'm going to die in the electric chair. And the look on his face was confusion, um, concern, genuine empathy for somebody to be suffering this much. But how was he supposed to know to say to that, right? And so I've done little versions of that throughout my whole life. Now, 30-some years of therapy, medication, exercise, doing my show, writing. Writing's a big one. It helps me get ahead of it. That's probably not the way to say it. It helps me to remove myself from these situations before it becomes all-consuming, if that makes sense.
Oh, it makes perfect
Yeah.
sense. Yeah, it's something that I have more questions, but I want to pull on a specific thread of what you just said from like an anxiety perspective.
Okay.
So whether it's true OCD or anxiety, like the emotional attachment to that feeling, because that's the problem. Is like when someone explains, something that's going on in their mind, people are like, oh, well, that's not going to happen. It doesn't matter that it will or will not happen. It feels very real to this person, and you can see like actual physical manifestations of that. Their heart rate can go up tremendously, and their muscles can tense, and like it becomes the reality. Even if it's not real, it becomes reality to them. And I think that's the hardest thing to explain to somebody when they've never experienced it themselves. Like you and I can describe it all day, but if they've never felt it, and I'll get a little personal on that. I made a video about it earlier that I posted, but I've had issues with night terrors. And they're ultimately a manifestation of the issues with anxiety that I have. But it leads back to a particularly traumatic part of my life where I was dating a woman and she passed away unexpectedly. And that representation of that is in the dream. I'm back there the night she died, except everybody else is there too, and they're all telling me it's my fault.
Oh.
Now I know there was nothing I could have done. I know that. And I can believe that all I want. But some part of me holds on to this notion that I did. And when I'm in that, like, calling it a bad dream is like, just feels hollow, because it might as well have been real. And so I hadn't had one in a couple of years, but some stuff's happened in my personal life here recently that's kind of brought up other feelings of that. And so last night, or I guess technically this morning, about 6 a.m. I'm in a cold sweat. My heart is pounding. I wake up my wife, and it's you. If you didn't know anything else, you'd be like, "Oh, he's having a heart attack over something that isn't really happening in the world, but it is very real in here." And that is just as, if not more terrifying.
Yeah. It's you ever heard the phrase "a failure of imagination"?
No, tell me.
You've never heard that? Okay. So like I'll tell you who never has a failure of imagination, and that's an anxious person. Because you hit it on the head. The stories are being told in our heads, and emotion is attached to that. Now, our brains have a logical side and an emotional side. Unfortunately, at least at this stage in our evolution, and I'm not a scientist or anything, this is just my understanding of it. The lizard brain, or the one that will get you away from the bear that's charging at you, is going to react before the logical one does. And I think what people don't understand, especially people who are anxious, or at least when they're kids, it's not described to them, is that emotions aren't necessarily truth, but they feel like truth.
Mm-hmm.
And in my one-man show, I talked about, I thought I was going to get put put in an oven and cooked. And the woman, it was a pastor at my church at the time, very kindly tried to say, well, that's not going to happen. I'm like, yeah, but you're missing the whole point. The point is that I thought it up and now I can't stop thinking about it. And
Right.
that is now the worst case scenario.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you have something traumatic like you just described from your life, a horrible loss of somebody you cared about, there's going to be emotions and tags to that. And then when when you go into the emotion, man, logic and emotion can't talk to each other.
Mm-hmm.
And another thing that OCD people love to do is I always go, I'll think my way out of this, but that it doesn't work because the brain is pretty great. All hail the brain, whatever. But it also gets a little confused. If you're thinking about something from back when, part of your brain thinks that's what's going on now. And so you're feeling it now. And that's why I wrote I wrote a joke letter to the intelligent creator. I was like, hey, motherfucker, could you have at least had logic go first? Can we get to logic first yet? No, not yet? Okay, well, I'll keep waiting. That's fine. And I'm somebody who's in my life has dealt with emotional regulation issues. It grows so much inside of me, and people might not even know that's what's going on. And all of a sudden, it's like, wah! I'm worried about this. And people are like, what? What's going on? But I've been telling myself the same story. And I think this is true of a lot of anxious people. You're telling yourself the same story over and over and over again. And it becomes more and more real. And that emotion attaches to more and more things. And so it's harder to get rid of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's a vicious cycle. That's like the ultimate like illustration of a vicious cycle.
Absolutely.
And so, yeah, and like on my side of things, you described it so well. Like some of just in this conversation alone, like some of the ways that you're describing your experience, like thank you for putting the words together that I wasn't able to do. Because yeah, it's so hard to explain it to people that I understand that this is irrational to you. It goes against logic. It goes against it. But from an emotional standpoint, it feels very, very real to me. And
yes.
Right now, that's all that matters. And you mentioned earlier also about like the OCD side of like, oh, I'm going to think my way out of this.
Yeah.
That becomes such a part of this equation too.
Mm-hmm.
And so I spent the better part of my life trying to think my way out of everything. And I did a good job a lot of the time. It actually ended up doing well for me in a lot of ways. But the downside is there will inevitably come a time where you're faced with something that you couldn't think your way out of. And then what do you do?
You try harder, Will. No,
sure. I mean, that's what you tell yourself. But eventually you realize, at some point, I hope everyone realizes one day that like at a certain point, you have to accept that there are things you can't outthink. You can't outthink grief. You can't outthink loss. There's certain things you just have to accept them for what they are. And so something that my therapist like got me on that I thought was really, really beneficial was I spent so much of my life, like I said, trying to avoid the issue altogether by planning and organizing and doing those things to avoid that worst case scenario you were describing.
Uh-huh.
Well, what if instead I lean into the worst case scenario and accept that as reality? What would I do then? Is it actually as bad as I think? So the example I've used in my book and in other places is, oh, I made this mistake at work. That mistake is going to lead my boss to get mad at me. My boss is going to get mad at me, and then they're going to fire me. And then next thing I know, I'm living on the streets. I go from this small, tiny mistake that ultimately no one probably cares that much about. And my brain has allowed me to get to this scenario where I'm now homeless and have nothing left for me.
That's exactly it.
So then in this practice, so you're using this example, I would do everything I can to avoid the mistake, to never have this issue, so I never get there. And instead she's like, well, let me ask you, let's say all those things happen, everything exactly as you laid out as a plan, and you lost your job. What would you actually do? if I actually
Do you,
do that, and so then you start going through, and then I'm like, okay, well, probably go kiss my wife, and I would, sit down, and I'd figure out, what are my next moves, what skills, what's our financial situation look like, and I'd start laying out a plan. And now that gives my brain the activity that it needs. It still needs the activity, right? It still needs to focus on something, but instead of focusing on trying to avoid this thing, I'm now leaning into it and putting that energy in a different place. And I'm saying, okay, well, actually, yeah, you know, if that's what if that's what's gonna happen, this one mistake is gonna lead me down a path, and they're gonna let me go because of this one thing. I can handle that, and you can start building confidence in those moments that you maybe wouldn't have had otherwise if you're just trying to avoid them all the time.
it's true, and it's what you just described. I call the voice, the anxiety, a world. Okay, so the voice says the oh, to use your example, and I think it's a great example. Let's say you were my boss, and Will, you came in and you said, "Hey, Kevin, can you hop into my office for a second?" The
Mm-hmm.
voice goes, "Well, you fucked up. You've done something wrong." The anxiety is that feeling, that emotional feeling, and the world is exactly what you said. All of a sudden, you're living on the streets, and it goes like
Mm-hmm.
this, like this. It's just like boo, and then you get there, and then it's having to come back from that, while also remaining calm about whatever it is. And you were just like, "Hey, thanks for coming in. We're gonna throw a surprise party for Steve, and I wanted to talk to you about it." And you're like, "Oh, oh," and you like have one box under. You're like, no. And the what if question, I had a therapist, and I'd be like, well, what if this happens? And she would just say, you'll deal with it.
Mm-hmm.
And man, I used to be like, and she goes, you'll deal with it.
Yeah.
I said, yeah. And that, like, for example, when you're trying to find a place to live, one of the more
Right.
stressful things to do, I've spent so much time being like, oh God, what am I going to do? And then I stopped myself and said, now, Kevin, are you really just going to not do anything and just wait till your lease is up and then just put all your stuff on the street? No, you're not going to do that. But you're trying to solve a problem, the whole problem in the moment when it's actually a number of many small steps. Look at apartments, apply for apartments, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. It's and that's what I'm saying. And then you give yourself that feeling of like, instead of it being anxiety and what could happen, the what ifs, you're now playing the planning game, which still just gives your brain something to do, which sometimes is just calming in and of itself. You've mentioned the compulsions before, like you mentioned counting,
Yep.
right? You know, what is like, I imagine most of what that gives you is just like a reassurance, if nothing else. You need something else to like walk through it and need something to focus around. Do I have that wrong?
No, it is that the problem with compulsions. I'm lucky, very lucky, in that they don't really impede on my day-to-day life. But
Ah,
there are people who have very serious issues with compulsions. In the easiest to understand example, I think, would be people who have to wash their hands over and over and over and over again. I
yeah,
luckily don't have that.
because at face value, you're like, well, that's good. You're cleaning your hands, but we're not talking about a couple
No,
times in a day.
we're
We're
talking like
talking
20
to
times.
where
Your
their
hands are
skin.
bleeding,
Yeah,
that type of thing, like that.
right.
So I count my steps. I do a thing with my pinkies where I count to 16 as if it's a calming thing, and it's a way to hide it. I have to touch things with my left then my right first, and if I don't, I'm like there. It's like something bad's gonna happen, which is what comes into that magical thinking. And so the compulsion is there just to roll back the feeling of anxiety. It's not solving shit. It's solving nothing. At least the innocuous ones that I'm talking about, counting and all that stuff. But it helps you. It helps calm your brain, which is going at 10 million miles an hour, and you're like, oh well, I touched with my pinkies. Everything should be fine now until 3 seconds later when I'm worried about something else.
So do you find like knowing that like once you've completed like you touch the left and the right,
Mm.
once you complete that, is there a sense of like calm that comes from that, or like what happens
Yeah,
next?
it's like a minor calm. I mean, it's not like I'm not what one would call a calm person,
Sure.
but it just assuages that fear, that what I call the voice and the anxiety in the world, um, that anxiety, what's so pernicious, one of the things that's so pernicious about anxiety is there's a reason we feel anxious about things. It's to keep us
Right.
safe. The problem
Right.
is more somebody who suffers from anxiety, they're in fight or flight mode all the time when they do not need to be. It's not like, oh, there's a bear, I need to run. It's like, oh, I didn't touch that door the right way. Oh my God, is my family going to be okay, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a Band-Aid at best. And so they do this. Have you ever heard of exposure therapy?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes.
So I always, that was explained to me once by a therapist. I go, fuck that. I'm not interested in doing that. But I have a good friend of mine. She suffers pretty strongly from OCD, and one of the best things to do is you just need to slowly expose yourself to the things that you're afraid of, and not try to immediately wipe it away with the compulsions. Because again, yeah, they might help in that moment, but they're not solving anything. They're just adding. It's just another form of stress, if that makes sense.
Right. Yeah, it's I I have so many questions and things I want to go to. I do want to actually pull on a specific because I know we're almost getting to an hour at this point,
Okay.
which is crazy to me.
I know it's
But
flying by.
I want to talk to you about medication for your
Mm-hmm.
OCD. So you mentioned that you try being off it, you try being on, you're on it, and you find that that's the best way for you. So what, at what age did you start taking medication?
Here's another OCD thing of mine. I know the date I started taking medication. It was June 23rd, 2000.
Okay.
So it was right after I graduated high school.
Okay.
And it was a low dose of medication. And it was Paxil. And a couple years later, I was in college. And I was having a real hard time with anxiety. And so I was recommended a place where I could go. Now, this is a story I love to tell because it's something else. So I had a therapist, but then I had a psychiatrist. He prescribed the pills. I talked to the therapist about, everything else. And I went in to talk to him, and he wasn't even looking at me. He was like looking away from me, which was weird. And I was on a couch, and he's like, well, tell me what you worry about. And I thought to myself, very similar to how I thought when I was talking to my dad about well, I better tell the truth, right? So I just went, well, I worry about this. And I went, and there was a pause. Okay, this is a psychiatrist who hears this shit all day. There was a pause, and he goes, huh, that's weird. And I remember thinking,
That's
what do you mean
reassuring.
what do you mean that's weird? What's that supposed to mean? Oh, come on. So he overprescribed me medication.
Ah.
And I did the bad thing then. I hated how it made me feel, turned me into a zombie. I would just stop taking it, then start taking it. Never, ever do that. Never do that without a doctor's help. And frankly, my story is my story, but always speak with a doctor with medication.
Mm-hmm.
I then lived in India for 3 months for a job, and I was on a real low dose of medication, not enough really, and I was taking malaria pills because you had to, and the malaria pills were interacting with it in a negative way. And so I was like in really bad shape. And so when I got back, I said to my psychiatrist, I was like, hey, we might want to try something else. So I moved on to Prozac. And I've been on every dose of Prozac. There's only 4, 20, 40, 60, 80. When I got to 80, which is the highest dose, obviously, it made me have worse symptoms. It like did the opposite. And so now I take, like the first line of my one-man show was, my name is Kevin, and I'm on a heroic dose of Prozac. So I take 60 milligrams of Prozac a day. And it does help. It helps with the neurotransmitters. I'm not going to be able to say it well. But it doesn't change who I am. In the past, I've had medications that have changed who I am, and I did not like that. And I have friends who have been terribly misprescribed medication and had just really bad negative after effects. So it is something that you need to do with a professional. But I've just come, I think it was about 17 years ago maybe, I thought, oh, I'll try not taking this anymore. And it was horrible. It was all awful. It was awful. And I said, okay, well, I guess I got to be on this for the rest of my life. Now, there are other forms of treatment that I have not tried. And I'm not saying anything against those or saying the medication's the only way. I will say, in my opinion, just throwing a pill at somebody and then not doing any therapy with it it's not really solving the problem. It's, again, another form of a Band-Aid. But yeah, my favorite game is, I think, so I'm 42 and I'm like, well, come on now, Kevin, you don't need one of those day of the week pill things yet. But one of my favorite games is, did I take my Prozac today? And then I sit there and I'm like, and then I start to worry, well, if I miss a dose, well, then tomorrow's going to be bad. And well, but if I take too much, I'll throw up. And then that goes on for like 4 minutes. And then finally I'm like, okay, I didn't take it, or yes, I did. And I move on, but it's, I just need to get one of those days a week thing is really what I'm
Yeah,
saying.
because you know for sure. You're like, Tuesday, yep, there's the pill. Okay, I did not take it. Because otherwise, you're playing this guessing game, and you hope you're right. But unfortunately, with a lot of medication, if you're wrong, it's terrible effects. And
Yes.
so, yeah, I would definitely recommend doing that. I became that person a while ago. I take something for my stomach. I
Hmm.
have a condition where I have too much acid at any given time. Um, and so I take something every day for that. And then I had never had medication for mental health um, until recently. Um, and I do, but it's a sort of unorthodox thing. It's not like something specifically tied to a disorder. It's just more about the physical aspects of things. So what they were finding with me was with my issues with anxiety, I was having an increased heart rate far too often,
Yep.
and I'm also genetically predisposition thanks to family history of heart conditions. And so you tear those two things together, and it's like if we don't learn to regulate this to on some level, you're going to wear out that heart of yours, before you're 40.
Exactly.
And so it's like, and that's the thing, like people don't, they think in terms of the mind and they're like, oh, it's mental. It's all kind of like up there, but it's like, it really does have a true impact on the physical as well. And so like, as a great example, like last night, so I take one in the morning and one in the evening. Um, and I just took it instead of at when I would normally wake up maybe like 7 or 8. I took it at like whatever time it was that I woke up from the night terror. I was like, I'm just gonna go ahead and do this and calm my heart down now. And I didn't take another dose, but it was great because like I truly thought my heart was gonna pop out of my
Yeah.
chest. And and so it was nice to have that there. And I know I've talked to people that have other anxiety disorders that take specifically anxiety medication. Same thing. It's not even always about taking the medication. It's just knowing that they have it is enough to go, oh, I can get through this.
Yeah. So yeah, I take obviously Prozac, but I take as needed Ativan,
Okay.
but it like half a milligram, and I rarely take that. But that's like, my panic attacks used to be real bad, and I get to a point where I can't even speak. Like I stutter and I can't talk. I can't get the words out. All of that, and I'm very thankful for the medication. And by the way, I take something every morning for my stupid stomach, and it's stupid acid. It's just omeprazole, but hey, man, uh, there's an easy way to know when you've forgotten to take that medication. You're eating, you're like, what the hell is going on? And you're like, oh shit, forgot the pill this morning. You know,
Yeah.
that was a lifesaver for me. I have bad acid reflux. I
Uh
have to
huh.
sit up before I go to bed. It's just no fun, no
Dude,
fun at all.
I because I didn't know what was wrong with me. It's omeprazole is what I do
Uh
too,
huh.
by the way. Um, and it was so crazy. I remember like all of a sudden out of nowhere, the pain had gotten so bad. I had my roommate at the time take me to the hospital because
Yeah.
it just like, and they were like, oh, his like pancreas is going to explode or something. And it's like, nope, it's just awful high amounts. I went to a gastroenterologist and like, look, here's the deal. And like, I tried the whole like sleep, or not sleep, the diet, like where you can like diary, where you kind of like look for sort of triggers and stuff. And we just couldn't find anything specific that was like, this is definitely the cause every single time.
Right.
So it was like, all right, you have two options. We can either keep trying to find this concoction of what it is, or you can take this every day and then you won't probably have to worry about it. And I was like, I think in this situation, I'm just gonna just gonna take
So
the pill.
yeah, and before you took the omeprazole, were you like I was just like fucking popping Tums all day?
Well, I didn't know at the time. I didn't know it was acid reflux. And then thankfully, I have a sister who's a pharmacist, and so one day, like after the hospital thing, she was like, "Well, if this is the problem, then you need to go get Tums or something like that." And then I was like, "So really, this thing?" Like, in my experience with acid reflux or heartburn at all was very mild, and I had taken Tums like occasionally. Hell, when I was in high school, I did the Blazing Challenge at beat ups.
Oh
Like
wow.
I had no issues with it whatsoever. And then out of nowhere, it became a problem.
Yeah,
And but like I'm like, really, that's what's gonna say? And she was absolutely correct. Once again, trust medical professionals. They know what they're doing.
they do.
And
They generally do.
yeah, they do. And even because I get it, because even the way you're describing it, like it sounds like, well, you say they know what they're doing, but then and look at Kevin's story. He was all over the place trying this, trying that. Part of this is research. It's part of it is understanding how each drug is going to interact with your individual body. So I think it's a lesson we can all take seriously, which is that even when we're following science, we have to follow the scientific method, which involves testing and trying things out. And we may not get it right every single time, but we're still making an informed decision and we're learning towards the future.
Yeah, and there's a reason it's called practicing medicine.
Right.
It's not called knowing everything about medicine
Mm-hmm.
or because it's human beings and because of the research, as you said. But most doctors or nurse practitioners, my sister's a nurse practitioner, um, they're just they want to help and they're trying to help. And they don't,
Right.
first do no harm, right? The Hippocratic Oath. Um, but people are going to make mistakes, and you just got to kind of roll with it, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and I think it's a great illustration of like the mental health journey as well,
Yes.
right? Like you're going to make mistakes, you're going to get things wrong. But as someone who was afraid to go down some of the rabbit holes that I have in my mental health journey, I think a lot of it was like, well, I was afraid to be wrong or afraid to make things worse. That's a potential. I'm not going to say it's not. I'm not going to look you in the eye and say that you may not end up somewhere you'd rather not be when diving into your mental health. However, I can absolutely guarantee you that it won't get better if you don't start trying things. And that's the really difficult part for this. Is like, I get it. It's scary to try new things and try therapy and try maybe a medication if it's recommended to you by a professional. All these things are scary. I'm not going to say they're not, but I can absolutely guarantee you if you are in this place where you're debating those things, it's definitely not going to get better if you don't try something.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I'll add to that. I think a lot of people maybe will try therapy one
Mm-hmm.
time and be like, I didn't like him or I didn't like her or whatever. You're not always going to click with every therapist,
Right.
right? There does need to be a personal connection there. But that doesn't mean you should stop trying, right? There is somebody out there for you. There are thousands of people out there for you that are there to help, and there are people in your life, friends, family members, members of your community who really do care, and they want to know about your story, and they have a story too. And I think if you, you know, the other thing is, we got to be kinder to ourselves. I'm such a shithead to myself. I'm such a pile of shit to myself. See what I just did? And we got to be kinder to ourselves because I've had therapists say, well, Kevin, if somebody else came to you and said that they were struggling with this, I'd say, well, yeah, that makes sense. That's normal. She goes, well, why is it a problem with you? And I say, well, because it's me. And she's like, do you see how that doesn't make sense? I said, I'm taking your copay back. I'm just kidding.
Oh man, I had almost a verbatim situation
Oh,
of
really?
mine having this. Like it was, because I think the way, well, maybe not quite verbatim, but very similar. The way she was, if you heard anyone speak to anyone the way you speak to yourself, what would you do? Because like one of my like triggers in my life is bullies. That's like the one thing that will very much get me angry at any situation. I can go from 0 to 100. If I see any version of bullying,
Yep.
I can't help myself, and I have to intervene, and I don't know why. It's just in me, which is not a bad thing per se, but I'm the biggest bully to myself in that same spirit. I am very much a bully to myself, and it took me like it was an aha moment of like, oh wow, I would never tolerate this behavior from anybody else, but yet I'm
Exactly.
okay with doing it to myself. That hurt.
It does
That hurt
hurt.
to hear.
And
It hurt to hear.
then you start
To your
to
point,
see it.
I'll take your copay back.
Yeah, no shit. I was like, give me that $20 back. You start to see it. Here's an example of how it was. I misplaced my phone 72 times an hour, it feels like, or I misplaced my keys, whatever it may be. And something I did for years and still catch myself doing is like, you fucking idiot, or Kevin, I hate myself. Why would you do that? That has consequences when you speak to yourself that way. And it's so easy. It's such an easy habit to get into, and it's a pretty difficult habit to get out of. But you do not, and a friend of mine says, why are you talking to my friend Kevin that way? And I say, that's a good question. I said, because he deserves it. Next. No, I'm just kidding.
That's how it feels, though.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah. And I think I don't know if you've had this experience yet, but like the next evolution of that understanding for me was like understanding that for, at least in my case, it's ego driven.
Absolutely.
It's ego driven. I would never expect anybody else to uphold that standard the way I am. I get so mad at myself that I'm a bully, as I've worded, and the real reason is because I think I'm capable of perfection at all times. And so it's like, oh, so you actually just like deep down, you just think you're better than everybody else. And like that really hurt because I don't want to believe that. I don't want to believe that I think that way. But in my mind, it's the only logical explanation for why I think it's possible that I get held to the standard and I should beat myself up a million times over when I would never do that to anybody else.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I used to call the voice in my head Frank. Not that I hear voices, but the inner critic. And then I went through some work this past summer, and the woman I was working with, really encouraged me. Okay, let's not give it a name. So I call it the artist formerly known as Frank. And Frank's the artist formerly known as Frank is a real prick. And it's very easy to hear that narrative and be like, this is what's going on. This is what's reality. And then when you go into that, the prep call I was on before you and I started talking, the gentleman was a cancer survivor, and he has his 4 truths. And basically the first one is like controlling what you can control and knowing, not letting your mind control you, you control your mind. And I think when people are emotional or anxious, they forget that they have control over this. It's our choice, right?
Yeah, and that's a hard lesson in and of itself. You mentioned the voices in your head. I heard a great quote one time, and I wish I could give the credit to it. I don't remember for the life of me who it was, but they said the only difference between you and a schizophrenic person is that you're arrogant enough to think the voice inside your head is you.
Yeah.
And I when you were talking about Frank, I was like, see, that's the thing. You're just giving a voice. You're just giving a name to it. But like we all have an internal.
Oh yeah.
Actually, I've learned that not everyone does have an internal monologue. Some people think in terms of visualization.
Yeah.
That blew my mind.
But
there's not a voice running at all times.
Yeah, it's constant. That's one of the main reasons I love reading, is my inner voice takes a backseat to the story. And why I love doing Behind Beautiful Things is because not only are these people coming on and sharing their stories, helping others, they're helping me, because stories are there to help us. That's how we communicate as human beings.
Well, Dan, I think that's the mic drop.
All right.
I think that's the mic drop. I think that's the perfect way to end this.
Awesome.
So now we get to the fun part, which is the shameless plugs.
I love a good shameless plug.
Where can we find
you? you can find me. Behind Beautiful Things is wherever podcasts magically appear on your devices. You can find us there. Now, we have a website, which I still have not updated, but I will one day soon. But the website is sadtimespodcast.com. Again, it's called Behind Beautiful Things. Let's see, this Tuesday will be our 129th episode. Wow, and let me tell you something. This week's story, it's actually a two-parter. Anyway, it's a crazy story. What an amazing man. You can find me about my public speaking at kevincrispin.com, KevinCrisp as in Paul IN. And then I have a Substack as well where I try to write satirical things to try to help myself make sense of whatever the fuck is going on in the world. And that's all conviction.substack.com. So there you go. So yeah, please. And one other thing I'll say about Behind Beautiful Things. Again, the goal is to help people feel less alone. So if you hear a story and you know someone in your life that would benefit from hearing that person's story, please share it with them. Because maybe they wouldn't even know the podcast exists. But if you send that to them, then maybe they'll hear something and be like, oh, maybe I'm not, whatever, this one-of-a-kind person. I'm not alone. And that's the whole goal of the show. So, yeah, Behind Beautiful Things. And Will, thank you very much, by the way, for having me on. This has been one of the faster hours I've ever had in my life.
Absolutely. Every single time it flies by quicker than I ever thought. And yeah, for as far as this show is concerned, so if you were awesome enough to catch it live, great. If not, it will be available on Spotify and YouTube later today. It will also be on my Instagram feed as well. So
awesome.
Thank you all. Yeah, thanks everybody. And I hope you all have a great day.
Have a great day, guys. Bye.